For our last phonological example, I'm going to present this look at Russian phonology. And as I've mentioned, morphology and phonology often work together, or by doing morphology, putting suffixes on words in this case, we can also discover phonology we might not have discovered otherwise. We saw that in English, right? We had wait and wade. The regular forms of the verbs sound different, but when we put on that ing, waiting and waiting, they sound the same. So that's an example we saw in English, and now we're going to see a similar example in Russian. Now you don't need to worry, of course, about what I mean by nominative or genitive. Those are grammatical terms that don't apply too well to English. I have sort of translated them here. So nominative singular, that's just river, but genitive plural, that means of the rivers. And so this data set is very neatly arranged. It has the singular right next to the plural, and it's a lot to look at. So we're going to break it down into little pieces, but you will see some alternations. And if you already see some alternations, we'll talk more about them on future slides. So let's pretend for just a second that this was the full data set. I've deleted a bunch of the alternations. And so all we have here is these forms where it looks like we can say ah. I put that hyphen in front of it to show it's a suffix that goes in on the end of words. If this were our data set, we could just say ah is our nominative singular suffix. And for some reason, the genitive plural either has nothing as its suffix. You can see I'm putting that fancy 0 on it to say that suffix is not pronounced. It's nothing at all. And we're used to those from English. In English, most of our present tense verbs have no suffix. So when we say I sing, we go, they roar, there's no suffix on there. But if we put those in the third person singular and say she sings, it goes, he roars, in those cases, we do add a suffix. So here, if this was just a morphology problem and I said identify the nominative singular suffix in Russian, you can look at this data set and you could say, okay, I see we're adding ah in all the nominative singular forms, so ah is the nominative singular suffix. There's no phonology happening here whatsoever. It's just a simple morphology problem. But now let's go back and look at those forms that alternate. Now I took out the nasals and liquids so we can really focus on what's happening, but don't worry, we will come back to them. And here we can see that stops and fricatives do seem to alternate between the suffixed and the unsuffixed forms. And we can say null suffixed, which means there's an unpronounced suffix, an invisible, unhearable suffix. And we will come back to those other ones, as I say. So when you look at this data set, I've broken it down into labials, alveolars, post-alveolars, and velars. And when you look at those, when you compare B and P, or D and T, or J and Sh, or G and K, can you tell me right now, before I reveal, what feature is alternating here between those nominative singular and genitive plural forms? So the answer is voicing. On the form on the left, we see a voiced version of the stop, and the form on the right, the null suffixed form, or the form without a suffix, has a voiceless stop or fricative. Remember, we'll talk about in a second what that means. So we can form two hypotheses. We can think about this scientifically. We can say they're either becoming voiced in the suffix forms. There's a phoneme that becomes voiced, or we can say that there's a phoneme and it becomes voiceless. So let's just look at those labial examples for fish. By the way, that upside down M, that is a sound we don't have in English. That is a high back vowel like oo, but when we say oo, our lips are round. This is the non-round version. So this is ooh. So I'm smiling when I say that, even though my tongue is in the back of my mouth. Ooh. So this is ruba and rup. I don't know, for my Russian speakers out there, I'm sorry for however far I am from the actual sound there. So our first hypothesis we consider is that P is pronounced B when suffixed. Maybe we could say when before vowels or before ah. We can refine that hypothesis later, but the suffixed forms are undergoing some sort of voicing in this hypothesis. And a second hypothesis here is that ba is becoming voiceless when null suffixed, and we can probably say it's happening at the end of words. But what we definitely know is it's happening in these null suffixed or unsuffixed forms. So with this tiny piece of the data set, we can't pick one of these hypotheses. We have to say both of these hypotheses work. Either a P phoneme is being voiced or a B phoneme is becoming voiceless, because we don't have, in just these 4 words, we don't know what's happening. But we will eliminate one hypothesis, as you might have guessed by now, by looking at the full data set, the full partial set, right? Because we're still ignoring those nasals and liquids for now. So here's that partial data set again. But this time, instead of highlighting the alternating stops and fricatives, I've highlighted the non-alternating stops and fricatives. And now we find we have to throw one of these hypotheses out, which is how we do science, right? We form hypotheses and we throw them out based on evidence. So hypothesis number 1 says voiceless sounds voice or become voiced when suffixed. And maybe that's before vowels, maybe that's before ah, we'll figure it out. Hypothesis number 2 says that voiced sounds devoice when they are null suffixed, and that's word finally, or when there is no suffix or something. So take a second now, pause if you have to. Which of these hypotheses do we have to throw away? Hypothesis number 1, where voiceless stops and fricatives voice between or before vowels, is disproven by the highlight alternations. So consider hypothesis 1. We would, if we look at the forms for turnip at the top here, where we have repa, rape, we would actually expect reba for turnip. We would expect raboda for work. We would expect duja for spirit, and we would expect rega for river. That star there means these are ungrammatical, right? So those are not the forms we see. So because we don't see stops alternating between voiced and voiceless, when we have a voiceless stop or fricative in there, we can throw out hypothesis number 1. And that means we can focus on hypothesis number 2, where voice stops and fricatives devoice word finally. That's our only remaining hypothesis. And remember, devoice means lose their voicing. So voice stops and fricatives lose their voicing when they're at the end of words. In this partial data set, all plurals end with voiceless sounds. So rape, roop, robot, mot, dush, losh, reik, knik. All of those sounds end with the voiceless. All of those words end with the voiceless sound. So it's a neutralization process. The voiceless stops and fricatives neutralize. Voiced and voiceless stops and fricatives neutralize to just a voiceless stop and fricative group. Now, we were ignoring these for a while, but let's come back to them. We have these 6 forms, and they don't exhibit that word final devoicing, where only voiceless sounds are found at the end of words. And if they did, we would expect to hear different null suffix forms. So that little circle there says those are voiceless sounds. Russian doesn't even necessarily have these. Some languages do. So we would expect ran, opich, and platform. I'm not great at doing voiceless nasals and liquids, so those didn't necessarily sound great. But that's sort of what they would be if we had those voiceless ones there. But remember, what we said was not consonants devoice word finally. We said stops and fricatives devoice word finally. We can get a phonetic motivation from that. So voiceless nasal stops, N and M, and liquids like R, are rare. Maybe because it's hard to distinguish M and N. So if I say, or you can't tell the difference. If you were looking at my video, you would know I have my lips together for, and my lips apart for, but otherwise it just sounds like I'm exhaling through my nose. So those aren't terribly useful sounds. We need to preserve the meaning by preserving the sounds a little bit. And it might be hard to produce R, so I'm not sure if I'm making too much voicing there or not when I'm trying to say a voiceless R. So it's not surprising they're not found in Russian. You can tell by the fact that we don't have separate signs for them, separate glyphs for them. They're not found many places. So lots of language is distinguished voicing in stops like ba and pa, or fricatives like sa and za, or even some liquids like we talked about wa and hua, like whales and whales. In that, some languages do distinguish those, and so we have that special upside down W symbol. The fact that there's no IPA symbol here gives you a little hint that at least in the languages that were there at the founding of the IPA, there was no voiceless nasals or voiceless R. When we look at the word opera for opera, or for opera, nominative singular, Russian would never even have a word like opir if we voiced, for example, between vowels or in front of vowels. Opir would always become obir and every time we said it. So that's just another piece of evidence that we don't have voicing of voiceless or of all stops and fricatives. Now we need a little interlude here because I keep saying stops and fricatives, and there's actually an easier way to say that. And this is one phonological feature that I want you to know about. So here is here's the consonants and vowels that exist in Russian. So we talked about oral stops, fricatives, and affricates on our very first day of phonetics. Those sounds can be grouped as obstruents because they make or stop noise by obstructing the airflow. So obstruct, obstruent. These are obstructing sounds. And you can see there's a couple in Russian that Russian uses that we don't use in English. Some of them are more or less similar to English sounds. Some of them are pretty distant. Those were not in our data set, so we don't need to worry about those today, but I did want to give you the complete picture of Russian, especially because we have Russian speakers in our class. And now let's look down here at the bottom half of the screen. On our second day of phonetics, we talked about approximants, liquids and glides, and vowels. So you might have felt like, wait, why are we doing some consonants on one day and some consonants on another? Actually, phonologically speaking, the strange thing was talking about those nasals on the first day, because those are actually sonorants too. These are sounds made by resonating. So resonating like or l or e, a, ah. All of those are resonating sounds through our vocal apparatus. Unlike f or s or sh, we can hold those sounds. Those are continuant sounds, another phonological division, but they're not resonating. Sonorants, that's the green consonants and the vowels, is commonly used feature in rules and lets us talk more succinctly about fricatives and oral stops. So instead of saying fricatives and oral stops all the time, and who knows, maybe if we looked at this rule a little more, we might find something that puts the affricates in. There's no voiced affricates, so probably not, but we might see some evidence. We'll stick with using these features of these groups obstruents and sonorants, and so we'll use the feature plus or minus sonorant. So I should say a little more about neutralization. We did talk about it in English. So sometimes a sound only exists as an allophone of one phoneme, and a lot of times that's your first one you look at in Introduction to Linguistics. So when we looked at Korean, the only time you ever find s or sh is as an allophone of that s phoneme. So that's another reason, aside from the very straightforward environment, why we looked at Korean first. So same with some of what we talked about in English. So if you ever hear a t or a th, or that glottal stop sound in the middle of uh-oh or Trenton, you know that it's a T. All of those allophones are only allophones of one phoneme, and it's t. But we talked about another one, right? We talked about the flap, d. So when you have a d, that could be a t or a d. We talked about words like atom or atom, ladder or ladder, where they sound the same because the t and the d neutralize. That distinction is lost. That distinction is neutralized. We cannot tell the difference between a t or a d when someone speaks it naturally. We can produce a difference. We can say, no, I meant atom, or no, I meant latter, but we cannot go back on a recording and figure out a difference between them unless people have that vowel distinction we talked about before. So just one more time to remind you of this, phonemic distinctions are language dependent. So in Spanish and Japanese, t, d, and d are all distinct, even though they're all allophones of t in English. In Arabic and Hawaiian, t and the glottal stop are distinct. In Hindi and Bengali, the and t are distinct. The same is true in reverse. So in English, s and sh and t and ch are distinct phonemes, but in Japanese, just like we saw in Korean, s and sh are both allophones of s. And I don't know if this is true for Korean, but in Japanese, t and ch are allophones of t. So we're looking at a neutralization process here. And so that's one reason why we haven't drawn one of those nice little phoneme charts. So what we've concluded so far is all voiced obstruent phonemes of Russian appear to have a voiceless allophone, pronounced word finally, and a voiced allophone pronounced elsewhere, right? We're not going to be distinct. We're thinking it's word initially and word internally, but we're not going to say that because we want to be sympathetic to those Russian babies. They have 5 years to learn Russian. They can't be learning about word initially and word internally. They just need to know elsewhere. And we haven't seen any alternation of the voiceless phonemes, right? We saw rape and rape. Both of those were, there was a P sound in both of them. So we can make our rule, right? If you want to write it in prose, you'd write voiced obstruents are pronounced as voiceless obstruents word finally. You remember from class on Monday, we're going to erase some of these words, but this is what we've seen so far, is voiced obstruents are pronounced as voiceless obstruents word finally. And that is how we would read that one I wrote below there. So that underscore hashtag means word finally. So let's name this rule. This is something you almost never have to do in Introduction to Linguistics because you only deal with one rule at a time. But we're going to call it word final devoicing, or WFD. And it does work correctly. We can check back on our data set, right? We're still being good scientists, and we're going to test our hypothesis on the data, make sure it works. So here is a derivation chart. We start with all the underlying forms given here. UR means underlying representation, although sometimes people say underlying form. I know that's a little confusing. So with rabot, rabota, and rana, it all works totally fine. And same with mod, moda. When we have the mode there, that D gets devoiced because we have a voiced obstruent at the end of a word, and it needs to become voiceless. The rest of the words, they don't have voiced obstruents at the end. 2 of them have vowels at the end. 1 has a voiceless obstruent, and 1 has another kind of sonorant and nasal sound. But remember, like I said, we want our rule to be parsimonious. We have to use as few elements as possible. So let's look again at this rule where we say voiced obstruents are pronounced as voiceless obstruents word finally. So we don't need to specify when sounds say the same. That was my example about the Parmesan and Romano cheese containers. So we don't want to say obstruents become obstruents. So we take out that element, and then we just say word final voiced obstruents are pronounced as voiceless. If you want the word final at the end there, you could say voiced obstruents are pronounced as voiceless word finally. That would look a little more like the formal notation of the rule. And of course, the derivation's identical, right? Because why would there be any change? Now we're There's no reason those obstruents would switch and become something else. So saying that voiced obstruents become voiceless, the derivation is exactly the same. But we still want our rules to be parsimonious. And so we still have another step we can take here. We don't need to specify a phoneme as one of its allophones. In fact, whenever we can get away with that, with not doing that, we don't. We want a phoneme description to include as many of its allophones as possible, ideally all of them. So in Russian, our allophone, which looks like a D, we choose that because that's the elsewhere allophone. So we want all alveolar obstruents to be included in our definition of our phoneme, because this is a phoneme that is defined just as an alveolar stop. So we want to get rid of that distinction about it being voiced. So obstruents are pronounced as voiceless, word finally. So this is the final answer to the problem. Obstruents are pronounced as voiceless, word finally, or plus obstruent goes to minus voice in the filing environment before the end of a word. That's how I would read that formal notation if I had to read it. Usually I like to read the prose ones. So notice our derivation table does look a little different, but it produces the same data. So this rule is looking for obstruents at the end of words. So ran and rana, both of those end in sonorants. We said N is like a vowel in that sense. It's a resonating sound. And obstruents only include stops and fricatives. Moda and rabota, we exclude those because they end in vowels. Again, that's a sonorant. So the only two words that end with a obstruent, a stop or a fricative, are rabot and mod. We talked about mod already. That becomes voiceless to mot. That looks good. Rabot, that T does quote unquote become voiceless, but that doesn't affect the pronunciation. And because we get to make our rule have one fewer feature, we've made Russian now easier to acquire. We've succeeded, and we should do that. Let's look at some bad derivations now. So remember, the first thing we guessed was something we might call intervocalic voicing. That means between vowels. So we're going to say, and this is a rule that existed in Middle English or Old English, I forget which one. In that form of English, we voiced at least fricatives between vowels. So if you look at words like rose or use, you can see here in those words, we're voicing that sound and getting a different sound. Same in usual, right? We're not only voicing that sound, we are palatalizing it, like we talked about last week. So that rule did used to exist in English. It's precedented in language to have intervocalic voicing. Maybe even T becoming flap is a vestige of that. When we say total, that's got a voiced sound in the middle, even though it's a T. So it wouldn't be surprising. It's just that Russian doesn't have this. And so if we look at these forms, we would have to believe that the underlying form for mot is mot. And then when we add the a over here, mota becomes moda because this is an obstruent or a consonant between vowels. It gets voiced there. Rana would not get affected. So not only does this go against our theory about what the underlying forms are, most importantly, we get the wrong form here. If we had intervocalic voicing, if we made consonants voiced between vowels, we would get this T voiced and we would get raboda, which we don't. So we have to throw out this hypothesis completely now. We could also think about, okay, maybe we just devoice all of our obstruents. Maybe we need to make this rule even more general. Well, this doesn't work because, for example, rabot, we have a B in the middle there, it would get devoiced. So we get rapot, rapota, that's no good. We get the right example with mot, but it's not worth getting 3 wrong answers just to get the right answer here. So we throw that one out too. And finally, we could say, like, what if we just devoice the end of words? All consonants get devoiced. Obviously, that's not going to work because only obstruents devoice. So while everything would be okay except for ron, instead of Ron, we'd get Ron. Ron. I'm trying to do my voiceless nasal there, but it's not going so well. So this shows that we have looked at all of the possibilities and we've thrown out the hypotheses that don't work. And so again, we can go back to that previous slide and we know what our final answer should be. Okay, so I hope that was a helpful look at phonology with neutralization and with alternation and with morphology. Now the homework you're doing, the homework in Spanish is a little more like the Korean, but I think you'll find it, having watched this video, that it's a little bit helpful for that too.